My son-in-law raised a glass of wine that cost more than my first car. He looked at me across the dinner table in front of his investors and called me a loser. Everyone laughed. They thought they were laughing at a retired old-school principal. They didn't know they were laughing at the man who held the key to their entire financial world. My quiet response didn't just end the dinner. It ended his career. Before I tell you how a single sentence can unravel a man's life, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you believe that true strength is often the quietest right before it changes everything. The restaurant was called Oriole, a name that felt as pretentious as the air inside it. The clinking of crystal glasses sounded like a nervous heartbeat too fragile for the hushed, important conversations happening at every table. I sat on a chair that was probably worth more than my couch, a ghost, at a feast held in my honor, but not for my benefit. My son-in-law Mark was at the head of the table holding court. He wore a tailored suit that shimmered under the low lights, each movement a carefully rehearsed gesture of power and success. I wore my best suit, a simple navy wool I'd bought for my wife's funeral 10 years ago. It was a good suit meant to convey quiet dignity, but in this room, surrounded by glittering watches and designer labels, it felt like a relic from another time. A time when a man's worth wasn't measured by the brand he wore. A waiter silent as a shadow placed a plate in front of me. It held a single scallop surrounded by a mysterious foam and a scattering of tiny flowers. I looked at the dish and thought of my late wife Carol. She would have laughed. Not a mean laugh, but a genuine heartfelt chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "For this price, David," she would have whispered, "you could buy the whole boat." Carol was the one with the vision. The one who turned her grandmother's sauce recipe into a business we built from our garage. We worked side by side, smelling of tomatoes and basil. Our hands stained our faces, tired but happy. This world of foam and whispers was not our world. It was Mark's world. And as I saw the waiter discreetly place the bill, the very long, very expensive bill, near Mark's elbow, I felt a familiar quiet ache. It was Mark's world, but it was my money paying for the rent. The bill would be settled by the supplementary credit card I'd given my daughter Jessica, a card linked directly to the Harrison Family Trust, a trust built on Carol's legacy. Mark finally decided the moment was right. He tapped his glass with a fork, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the restaurant's murmur. Every eye turned to him. He beamed a conqueror surveying his domain. His potential investors, two men with cold eyes and expensive haircuts, looked at him expectantly. My daughter Jessica sat beside him, her smile a beautiful, brittle thing. She looked like a doll placed perfectly in a dollhouse, and I wondered when she had forgotten how to be real. "Friends, colleagues," Mark began, his voice smooth and practiced. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the future. A future of innovation, growth, and unparalleled success." He spoke of his tech company, Sterling Financial, using words like synergy and disruption and paradigm shift. It was a language designed to impress, to obscure the fact that beneath the surface there was nothing but debt and desperation. I knew. I had seen the reports from my financial advisor, but I had stayed silent. For Jessica. I always did it for Jessica. He raised his glass higher. But success is nothing without family. It's the foundation upon which we build everything. He gestured to Jessica, who blushed on cue. Then his eyes moved to me, and the warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a slick, condescending smirk. It was a look I had seen before, usually when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The look of a predator who has grown tired of pretending its prey is an equal. And of course, he continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "We must thank my father-in-law, David, the man who has retired from a long, noble career in education." He said the word education as if it were a communicable disease. The two investors chuckled softly. David is here to show us all that you don't need to be a winner to have a seat at the winner's table. The air grew thick. I could feel the insult land a physical blow. I looked at Jessica, pleading with my eyes for her to say something to intervene. She didn't. She stared at the intricate pattern on her plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. Her silence was her consent. Her silence was her betrayal. Mark, emboldened by her inaction, leaned forward and delivered the killing blow. He grinned a wide, predatory smile and asked the question that had been hovering in his heart for years. "Tell me, David," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "How does it feel to be a loser?" For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then one of the investors snorted, and it broke the dam. A wave of uncomfortable, sycophantic laughter washed over the table. They were laughing at me, the old man in the old suit, the relic, the loser. They laughed, and with each chuckle, something inside me that had been soft for a very long time began to harden. The part of me that had endured the subtle jabs, the condescending remarks, the blatant disrespect, all for the sake of a fragile piece, had finally turned to steel. My love for my daughter was a vast ocean, but I realized in that moment that I had allowed her husband to build a toxic oil rig right in the middle of it. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. A lifetime as a school principal had taught me that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. I simply waited. I let their laughter rise and then die out, leaving an awkward, ringing silence in its wake. I looked at each of the laughing faces one by one until their smiles faltered and they looked away. Finally, my gaze settled on Mark. He was still smiling, but the confidence in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected me to shrink, to be embarrassed, to fade into the expensive wallpaper. He did not expect me to look back. I gave him a small, placid smile. It was a smile Carol would have recognized. It was the smile I used right before I made a decision from which there was no turning back. And in a voice that was perfectly calm, perfectly level, and perfectly clear, I asked my own question. "Mark," I said, letting his name hang in the air for a moment, "how does it feel to know that this loser will no longer be paying your bills?" The effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had pulled a plug and drained all the sound and air from the room. Mark's smug smile didn't just vanish, it collapsed. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. The investor next to him, who had been laughing the loudest, froze with his wineglass halfway to his lips. I heard a fork clatter against a porcelain plate. And then I saw my daughter. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost breathtaking. The beautiful doll was finally horribly real. The silence that followed was louder than any laughter had ever been. It was the sound of a world ending. His world. And in that silence, I felt the first glimmer of peace I had known in years. The taxi moved through the city like a ship navigating a river of light. The flashing neons and glittering storefronts of Manhattan blurred past the window, each one a world away from the cold silence inside the car. The adrenaline from the restaurant had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't Mark's insult that echoed in my mind. Words from a man like that are weightless like ash. No, what I saw when I closed my eyes was my daughter's face. Jessica. The way she had looked down at her plate, the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her water glass. She had made a choice in her silence, a choice so clear and so painful that it felt like a physical wound. I had lost my wife to sickness, a battle we fought together until the very end. But I was losing my daughter to something far uglier, a sickness of the soul that valued money over love and appearance over truth. The phone in my pocket vibrated, a jarring, angry buzz against my leg. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew who it was. A part of me, a foolish fatherly part, hoped for an apology, for tears. For the daughter, I remembered the little girl who would run to me with a scraped knee seeking comfort. I pulled the phone out. The name Jessica glowed on the screen. I took a slow breath, held it, and then answered, placing the cold glass against my ear. I didn't even have a chance to say hello. Her voice was a shrill, panicked torrent, a flood of anger and fear. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "What is wrong with you? You ruined everything." I remained silent, listening to her ragged breaths on the other end of the line. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes curious before focusing back on the road. "Those were important people, Dad. Mark's investors. He has been working on this deal for 6 months." Her voice rose with every word. "And you just walk in and destroy it all with one stupid, selfish sentence. Do you have any idea how important that deal was to him?" And there it was. That one word. Deal. It wasn't about respect. It wasn't about the public humiliation of her own father. It wasn't about family or love or dignity. It was about a deal. In the cold, clear light of that single word, everything became sharp and focused. Mark wasn't just an arrogant fool. He was a user. He had staged that entire dinner not to celebrate anything but to perform for his investors, and I was a part of the stage dressing. I was the folksy retired father-in-law, a prop meant to signify stability and old money, a living, breathing financial statement he could point to. My role was to sit there, smile, and embody the wealth he was using to secure their trust. My outburst hadn't just been an embarrassment. It had been a catastrophic malfunction of his equipment. The hollow ache in my chest was replaced by a sudden cold clarity. The sadness was still there, but it was now encased in ice. She wasn't angry for me. She was terrified for herself, for the lifestyle that was now hanging by a thread. The thread I was holding. I let her frantic accusations trail off into a panting silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I let the weight of her words settle in the quiet space between us. Then, in a voice that was lower than a whisper, but heavier than a stone, I said the only thing that was left to say. "You've chosen your side, Jessica." I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't want to hear the excuses or the justifications. I pressed the red icon on the screen ending the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence that filled the taxi now was different. It was no longer the silence of grief or shock. It was the silence of purpose. The silence of a man who had finally accepted a terrible truth and knew with absolute certainty what he had to do next. I looked out the window not at the passing lights, but at the long, clear road ahead. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. I slept for maybe 2 hours, but it wasn't sleep that brought rest. It was a shallow, gray state of unconsciousness haunted by the image of my daughter's face. When I woke, the sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across my bedroom floor. The anger from the night before was gone. The shock had subsided. In their place was a clarity so cold and hard, it felt like a diamond had formed in my gut. I knew what I had to do. I did not call a lawyer. The time for legal threats would come later. First, I needed to understand the battlefield. I needed facts. I called Grace. Grace Connolly had been my financial advisor for 15 years. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that I had always found reassuring. She had helped me and Carol with our initial business planning for Carol's Kitchen. She had been there, a steady and compassionate guide through the nightmare of the medical bills. And she was the one who had structured the sale of the company and helped me create the trust. Her office wasn't flashy like the restaurant. It was a place of quiet competence filled with dark wood furniture, shelves of financial journals, and a faint, pleasant scent of old paper and coffee. It felt safe. It felt real. She greeted me at the door to her personal office, her expression one of professional concern. "David," she said, her voice soft, "I got your message. Come in, sit down. Can I get you some coffee?" She saw the answer in my eyes before I could speak. I wasn't there for pleasantries. I sat in one of the leather armchairs across from her large mahogany desk, and for a moment I just looked at her. She was a link to the past, to a life that had made sense. "Grace," I began, my voice steady, "I need you to do two things for me this morning, with immediate effect." She leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk, giving me her full attention. "First, I want you to freeze the supplementary credit card attached to the main trust account, the one in Jessica's name. As of this moment, it is to be declined for any and all transactions." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of her surprise. She knew Jessica had been using that card for years. It paid for everything from her groceries to her lavish vacations with Mark. To cut it off was like turning off the water supply to a mansion. She didn't ask why. She just made a note on a legal pad. "Consider it done," she said. "Second," I continued, "I need a full forensic audit of the Harrison family trust. I want a detailed report of every dollar that has been spent for the last 5 years. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every statement. I want to see where all of it has gone." This time she had to ask, "David, that's a significant undertaking. It will take my team some time. May I ask what this is about? Is everything all right?" I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly. "No, Grace. Nothing is all right." I paused, gathering my thoughts, not the emotions, but the facts. "You were there when I set this all up. You remember why." Her expression softened. She did remember. "This trust was never about the money," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The $50 million was just a number on a piece of paper. The trust was about Carol. It was about protecting her life's work." I could almost smell the spices from our old garage workshop, see the flower on Carol's cheek, hear her laugh as we worked late into the night, perfecting her grandmother's tomato sauce recipe. Carol's kitchen. It wasn't just a brand, Grace. It was our life. It was her dream. We built it from nothing. I looked out her office window at the bustling New York street below. When she got sick, all that money couldn't buy me one more day with her. After she was gone, the company felt hollow, just a building full of ghosts. So I sold it. And the lawyers, you and I, we structured the trust very specifically. You remember the terms. Grace nodded slowly. I remember them perfectly. You are the sole trustee for the remainder of your life. You have full and absolute discretionary power over the distribution of all assets. Jessica is the named beneficiary upon your passing, but until then, she has no legal control. None whatsoever. Exactly, I said, turning my gaze back to her. I am the trustee, the protector. I set it up that way to protect her, our daughter, from herself, or from anyone who might try to take advantage of her. But more than that, I did it to protect Carol's legacy, to make sure that what we built would be used for good, to provide security, not to fuel something else. I didn't need to describe Mark's arrogance or Jessica's compliance. Grace was smart enough to read between the lines. Last night, I said, my voice dropping lower, I came to believe that Carol's legacy is under direct threat. I believe her life's work is being used in a way she would have despised, as a tool for arrogance and greed. I have been blind to it for a long time, Grace. Too long. But my eyes are open now. So I need you to show me everything. I need to know the extent of the damage. Grace looked at me for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching my face. Then she closed the notebook on her desk, a gesture of finality. I understand, David, she said, her voice now crisp and all business. I'll put my best people on it immediately. We'll start with the credit card statements and Mark's business filings. If there's a connection, we'll find it. You'll have an initial report on your desk by 5 o'clock today. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in years. The diamond in my gut wasn't gone, but it no longer felt like a source of pain. It felt like a source of strength. Thank you, Grace, I said. As I walked out of her office and back into the unforgiving light of the city, I knew I had done the right thing. I had finally started to protect my wife's legacy, not just from the world, but from our own daughter. And I would see it through to the end, no matter what it cost me. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet anticipation. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read the newspaper. I sat in my study, the room that had always been my sanctuary, surrounded by books and the quiet, comforting presence of my wife's memory. A framed photograph of Carol sat on my desk, taken on a trip to the coast 20 years ago. Her smile was bright, genuine, and full of the honest goodness that had been the foundation of my life. I looked at that photo and felt the weight of my promise to her, a promise to protect what we had built together. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden bars of sun. For a few hours, the house was peaceful. And then the phone rang. It was just after 5 o'clock. The caller ID showed Grace Connolly's office number. My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs. I had expected a call, but the speed of it felt ominous. I answered, my voice calm. "David Harrison." "David, it's Grace." Her voice was different from the morning. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by a clipped, tense efficiency. There was no small talk. "I have the initial report, and we have a problem. A much bigger problem than we thought." I listened, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of my old oak desk. "The personal spending on the credit card is exactly as you suspected," she said, her voice tight. "Excessive. Lavish dinners, designer clothes, luxury travel. Thousands upon thousands every month. But David, that's not the real issue. That's just the tip of the iceberg." She paused, and I could hear the faint rustle of papers on her end. My team started digging into the public filings for Mark's company, Sterling Financial. We cross-referenced them with the trust's quarterly statements. "David, it appears Mark has been using the official statements from the Harrison Family Trust in his presentations to banks and private investors." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "What do you mean using them?" "He's been presenting them as evidence of his financial stability." Grace explained, her words sharp and precise. "He isn't forging withdrawals or directly taking money for these business deals. It's more subtle and more insidious. He is using the trust's $50 million valuation as a form of implied collateral. He's leveraging your name, Carol's name, to create the illusion that his failing company is backed by a massive, stable family fortune. He's selling them a lie, using your truth as its foundation." I was silent, processing the enormity of what she was saying. The insult at the restaurant, Jessica's panicked call, the obscene spending. They were all just symptoms. This right here was the disease, a cancer of deceit that went far deeper than I could have imagined. He wasn't just disrespecting me. He was defiling Carol's legacy, using the fruits of our honest labor to legitimize his house of cards. "Legally," Grace's voice cut through my thoughts, "this is an extremely dangerous gray area, David. It borders on financial misrepresentation. Depending on what he specifically promised these investors, it could even be considered a form of fraud." Fraud. The word landed in the quiet study with the force of a physical blow. It changed everything. My quiet, personal pain had just become a public legal liability. The battle I thought I was fighting had just moved to a much larger and more dangerous arena. This was no longer a family matter to be resolved with a hard lesson. It had crossed a line into something cold, criminal, and unforgiving. This wasn't about teaching an arrogant young man a lesson in humility anymore. It was about stopping a crime in progress. The peace of my home had been shattered. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a war room. Grace's phone call had drawn a line in the sand. The days that followed were a quiet, intense flurry of activity, not of angry confrontations, but of methodical, painstaking investigation. Grace, with my full authorization, engaged a forensic accountant, a man named Mr. Alistair Finch. He was a small, neat man with glasses perched on his nose and an almost preternatural ability to find the truth hidden in columns of numbers. He didn't work with emotion. He worked with data. And the data, as it turned out, told a story far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. For a week, Alistair worked in a secure data room at Grace's firm. He examined every digital transaction, every email correspondence related to Sterling Financial that he could legally access, and every single statement issued by the Harrison Family Trust. He was looking for the subtle connections, the faint fingerprints that Mark had left behind. I spent that week in a kind of limbo, trying to maintain a normal routine, but the truth was a constant low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. The house felt too quiet. The memories of Carol, which usually brought me comfort, now felt like a silent accusation. I had let this happen on my watch. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a conference call. Me, Grace, and Alistair. His voice was dry, precise, and utterly devoid of judgment. He simply stated facts. "Mr. Harrison," he began, "we have moved beyond the realm of implied collateral. We have found concrete evidence of active intentional fraud." Grace's sharp intake of breath was the only other sound on the line. I remained silent, bracing myself. "Mark Sterling didn't just show our trust statements to his potential investors," Alistair continued. "He created supplementary documents. We've managed to obtain copies from a source who became suspicious after a preliminary due diligence check. Mr. Harrison, your son-in-law, has been issuing letters of intent to his investors." Letters of intent. I asked, the term sounding foreign and clinical. "They are documents," Grace explained, her voice tight with anger, "that state a party's intention to perform a certain action, in this case to invest a specific amount of money. They are often used to secure the confidence of other investors in a funding round." Alistair cleared his throat. "That is correct. And these letters state in no uncertain terms that the Harrison Family Trust has committed to a lead investment of $5 million in Sterling Financial's next funding round. He has issued at least 3 of these letters to different venture capital firms." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And all 3 of them, Mr. Harrison, bear your signature." I felt the blood drain from my face. "My signature? I have never signed anything of the sort." "Of course not," Alistair said calmly. "We have had them analyzed by a handwriting expert. They are forgeries. Highly skilled forgeries, I might add, likely lifted from other documents you may have signed in the past, but forgeries nonetheless. He didn't just lie. He put your name, your legally binding signature on that lie. This is textbook securities fraud." Fraud. There it was again. Not a possibility. Not a gray area. A fact. A crime. He had taken my name, my identity, and used it to swindle people out of millions of dollars. But Alistair wasn't finished. "That discovery," he went on, "led us to a deeper dive into Sterling Financial's actual health. On the surface, it's all gloss and tech speak. But underneath, Mr. Harrison, the company is a shell. It is drowning in debt. Mark has been using new investor money to pay off old debts and fund his and Jessica's exorbitant lifestyle. He's not building a business. He's running a Ponzi scheme, robbing Peter to pay Paul. The company is weeks, maybe days away from total collapse. This new round of funding wasn't for growth. It was a last desperate gasp for air before he went under for good. And in that moment, the entire ugly picture snapped into focus. The dinner, the investors, the smug, condescending smile. It all made a new, terrible kind of sense. The insult he had hurled at me across the table. How does it feel to be a loser? It hadn't just been the casual cruelty of an arrogant man. It was the desperate projection of a complete and utter failure. He was the one drowning in a sea of his own lies, his ship sinking fast, and he had looked at me, his only possible lifeline, and called me a loser. It was the pathetic sneer of a man who despises the very thing he needs to survive. He didn't see me as a father-in-law or even a person. He saw me as a walking, talking bank account, a tool he was entitled to use, and he hated me for it. He hated his own dependency. My existence was a constant reminder of his own profound failure. The man who called me a loser was the biggest loser of them all. and he had tried to drag me and my wife's legacy down into the dark, cold water with him. The forensic accountant's report was a clinical, brutal document. It laid out Mark's deceit in cold, hard numbers and legal terminology. It was the what and the how. But as I sat in the profound silence of my house, I found myself grappling with the why. Not Mark's why, that was easy to understand. It was the simple, ugly greed of a desperate man. I was grappling with my why. Why had I allowed this to happen? Why had I been so blind for so long? My mind felt cluttered with facts and figures, a storm of legal possibilities and financial ruin. I needed to do something simple, something physical. I went up to the attic. The air upstairs was thick with the scent of old wood dust and time itself. It was a museum of our life together. Old furniture draped in white sheets stood like silent ghosts. Stacks of photo albums leaned against one another. It was a place I hadn't visited in years, a place I avoided because the memories were too sharp. I started moving a stack of old magazines, intending to finally throw them out, when my hand brushed against a cardboard box tucked away in a dark corner. On the side, written in a familiar, elegant script, were two words that stopped my heart. Carol's Kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the box out into the weak light filtering through the single dusty window. The tape was old and brittle. I peeled it back carefully, a strange reverence washing over me. The first thing I saw was a stack of paper napkins, the cheap kind, from the diner where Carol and I used to have coffee every morning before starting work in the garage. On them, in faded ink, were dozens of hand-drawn sketches. They were our first logo designs: a smiling tomato, a whisk and a wooden spoon crossed like a coat of arms, and the one we almost chose, a simple heart shape made from 2 basil leaves. I remembered us arguing and laughing over those designs, full of the impossible, reckless hope that only comes when you are building a dream from nothing. Underneath the napkins were the photos, faded Polaroids from a time before everything was digital. There was Carol, a smudge of flour on her nose, a brilliant, unguarded smile on her face as she looked at me from behind a mountain of fresh tomatoes. There was a picture of me, younger and thinner looking, utterly exhausted, but proud, standing beside the first pallet of jars, ready for our first ever shipment. I could almost feel the rough wood of the pallet under my fingers, the sense of accomplishment, the shared feeling that we were on the verge of something real. And then at the very bottom of the box was the treasure, her recipe book. It was a simple spiral-bound notebook with a worn, soft cover. I lifted it out. It felt sacred in my hands. I opened it. The pages were yellowed and stained with splashes of olive oil and tomato sauce, the ghosts of 1,000 batches of her incredible marinara. Her handwriting filled every page, detailing not just ingredients and measurements, but little notes in the margins. "Add more garlic," she had written on one page. "This is the one that made David dance in the kitchen," she had written on another. I ran my thumb over the crinkled paper, and the years melted away. This book was the soul of our company. It was the heart of our life's work. It was her. Holding that book, the dusty attic faded away, and I was somewhere else entirely. I was in a sterile white hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. The only sound was the rhythmic electronic beep of the heart monitor. Carol was frail, so frail, a pale shadow of the vibrant woman in the photographs. But her eyes, when she looked at me, were as clear and bright as ever. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "David," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of sound. "Promise me. Promise me 2 things." I leaned in closer, my heart breaking. "Anything, Carol. Anything." "Take care of our girl," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She can be easily swayed. Protect her." Then her eyes took on a fierce, protective light. "And our kitchen. What we built. Don't ever let anyone destroy it." Don't let them make it cheap. I squeezed her hand, my own tears blurring her face. I promise, Carol, I choked out. I will take care of our daughter, and I will never let anyone destroy what we built together. I promise. The memory shattered, and I was back in the attic, the dust motes dancing in the silent air. A wave of guilt so powerful it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. I had failed. I had failed in both promises. I had not protected my daughter. I had enabled her. And I had stood by while her husband, a charlatan and a fraud, had taken the legacy of our hard work, our love, our late nights in the garage, and cheapened it. He had used its good name to fuel his lies to pay for his gaudy, empty life. He had taken the soul of Carol's kitchen and tried to sell it for parts. The guilt was swiftly followed by a surge of anger, a cold, righteous anger that burned away all the doubt and sadness. This was no longer just about financial fraud or a legal battle. This was about a sacred promise made to the woman I loved. It was about honor. It was about her memory. I carefully placed the photos and the napkins back in the box. But I kept her recipe book. I held it to my chest as I walked down the attic stairs and back into the light. I now had the facts from the accountant and the motivation from my heart. I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't just going to stop a crime. I was going to keep a promise. The doorbell rang 3 days later. It wasn't a polite, neighborly chime. It was a series of sharp, frantic presses, one after another, an alarm bell of pure panic. I knew who it was before I even reached the door. I had been waiting for them. When I opened it, they stood on my porch, a portrait of unraveling chaos. Jessica's face was pale and blotchy, her eyes red from crying. Mark looked like a caged animal. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. His expensive tie was loosened, and his face was a tight mask of fury and desperation. They didn't wait for an invitation. They pushed past me into the entryway. "The card, Dad." Jessica began, her voice trembling. "It's not working. The payment for the car lease was declined this morning. And the club, they called about the membership dues. It was so embarrassing." Her words tumbled out a litany of first-world problems that sounded utterly pathetic in the quiet dignity of my home. She seemed to be expecting me to be surprised to fix it, to make the bad things go away as I always had. But Mark cut her off. He had no time for her theatrics. He was all raw, aggressive energy. He strode into my living room and slammed a leather-bound folder down on the coffee table. The sound echoed in the silent house. The mask of the charming, successful CEO was gone forever. In its place was the true face of Mark Sterling, a cornered, desperate man stripped of all pretense. "We don't have time for this," he snapped at Jessica before turning his eyes on me. They were cold, hard, and full of a furious sense of entitlement. "There's a clerical error at the bank," he said, his voice a low growl. "They need your signature to clear it up. It's just a formality." He tried to sound casual, but the lie was so thin it was transparent. His hand was shaking slightly as he gestured towards the folder. I didn't respond to his lie. I didn't acknowledge their panic. I calmly walked over to the coffee table, picked up the folder, and sat down in my favorite armchair, the one Carol always said was the throne of the house. I took my time opening it. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my reading glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief before placing them on my nose. Each small, deliberate action seemed to amplify their frantic energy. They stood there, shifting their weight, watching my every move. The document inside was thick with the dense, intimidating language of lawyers and bankers. But a few words stood out with perfect, damning clarity. At the top of the page in bold letters it read, "Loan Guarantee Agreement." And further down, next to a long empty line waiting for a signature, was the reason for their visit, the number that represented their last hope. $5 million. He wanted me to personally guarantee a $5 million business loan for his fraudulent company. He wanted me to tie Carol's legacy, my entire future, to his sinking ship. I read the entire document, even though I already knew what my answer would be. I let the silence in the room stretch until it was taut as a wire. I wanted them to feel the full weight of their desperation. Finally, I took off my glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them on the table beside me. I looked up first at my daughter, at her tear-streaked face and pleading eyes. I saw no remorse there, only fear for herself. Then I looked at Mark, at the pulsing vein in his temple, the sheer naked greed in his gaze. I slid the folder back across the polished wood of the table. No, I said. The word was quiet. It was not angry. It was not negotiable. It was a solid wall of granite, a final unbreakable end to the conversation. And that single word made Mark explode. The last shred of his civility vanished, consumed by a wave of pure, unrestrained rage. No, he screamed, his voice cracking. What do you mean, no? You stupid old man, don't you understand anything? This is our future. This is everything. He was pacing now, a predator in a cage of his own making. That money was supposed to be ours. It was always meant for us, for Jessica, not for you to hoard it. You're just a glorified babysitter for it. An old man sitting on a pile of money you don't even know what to do with. I looked at Jessica. She was openly sobbing now, her hands covering her face. But her tears were not for me. They were for the cars, the clubs, the clothes. She put a hand on Mark's arm, a weak, fluttering gesture. Mark, please. She whimpered, but there was no force in it. She did not defend me. She did not stand up for me. In this final, ugly moment, she stood with him. Mark shook her hand off, his eyes still locked on me, blazing with a hateful fire. He took a step closer, leaning over me, his face twisted in a sneer. He was out of options. The lies hadn't worked. The rage hadn't worked. All he had left was a threat. You'll regret this, old man, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea what you've just done. He then spun around, grabbed Jessica by the arm, and stormed out of the house. The front door slammed shut behind them, with a deafening crack, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. I sat there in my armchair, the throne of my quiet house, and I did not feel fear. I did not feel regret. I felt the calm, hard certainty of a man who had finally, after a long and painful journey, done exactly the right thing. He had threatened me, but he had no idea that I was already planning my next move. And it was not a defense. It was an attack. Mark's threat hung in the air of my house long after he and Jessica had gone, but it was an empty threat, a dog with no teeth. He thought he was the predator, but I had the full report from Alistair Finch's investigation sitting on my desk. I knew the truth, and the truth I was beginning to learn was a far more powerful weapon than anger. The next morning, I did what I should have done weeks ago. I took that report and I went to Wall Street. The law offices of Davies, Thorne, and Caldwell were on the 60th floor of a glass and steel tower that seemed to pierce the clouds. From the window in the waiting room, the city below looked like a circuit board, a complex map of power and money. My lawyer, William Davies, was a man who matched his surroundings. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair, and a mind that seemed to operate with the calm, relentless precision of a supercomputer. He had listened to my story without interruption, his face betraying no emotion as he reviewed every page of the accountant's report. Now he sat across from me at a vast, empty glass desk. He closed the final folder, placed his hands neatly on top of it, and looked at me over a pair of half-moon glasses. His voice was calm, but the words he spoke carried immense weight. Mr. Harrison, he said, I want to be perfectly clear. The evidence you have brought me is not just compelling, it is overwhelming. The forged letters of intent combined with the clear pattern of using the trust to mislead investors constitute a textbook case of securities and wire fraud. These are federal offenses. He let that sink in. If you wish it, I can make a call this afternoon. The U.S. Attorney's Office would likely open a grand jury investigation within a matter of weeks. Given this evidence, he tapped the folder. Your son-in-law would be facing a sentence of no less than 10 to 15 years in a federal prison. I had imagined this moment, this confirmation of Mark's criminality. I had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of righteous vindication. Instead, I just felt a profound and weary sadness. Prison. The word felt so brutal, so final. I thought of Jessica, of the little girl I had raised. As complicit as she was, as lost as she had become, she was still my daughter. And her husband going to prison, the public disgrace, the financial ruin. It would obliterate what was left of her life. That is not what I want, Mr. Davies, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I am not seeking revenge. I am seeking a correction. An end to the lies. I want him to be stopped, but I do not wish to be the man who sends him to prison. My wife, Carol, she would not have wanted that. There must be another way. I looked out the window at the sprawling city. I want him to face the consequences of his actions, yes, but I want those consequences to be the natural result of his own house of cards collapsing. I don't want to burn the house down myself. I just want to remove the foundations. Davies listened intently, a flicker of something that looked like respect in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair. A public implosion. Then he said, grasping the concept immediately. Not a private conviction. You want to strip him of his power and credibility, not his freedom. He steepled his fingers, his mind already shifting from prosecutor to strategist. In that case, timing is everything. My team has been monitoring Sterling Financial's activities since you first retained me. Mark is at a critical juncture. He swiveled his monitor around to face me. On the screen was a calendar. He is in the final stages of securing a Series B funding round. He has one last meeting to convince the lead investors, a venture capital firm by the name of Oakfield Capital. The meeting is scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in their boardroom. Everything for him, his company, his entire future hinges on this single presentation. If he succeeds in securing their $15 million investment, he can continue his charade for another year, perhaps longer. If he fails... Davies let the sentence hang in the air, the implication perfectly clear. I looked at the appointment on the screen. The boardroom. Not a courtroom. It was Mark's natural habitat, the arena where he felt most powerful, surrounded by the language and symbols of the world he worshipped. To confront him there, to dismantle his lies in the very place he believed he was untouchable, it was perfect. It was a lesson, not a punishment. It was justice, not vengeance. That's the place, I said, a sense of absolute certainty settling over me. That is where this ends. Mr. Davies nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. He turned the monitor back towards himself and began to type. Then we have work to do, Mr. Harrison, he said. We have a presentation of our own to prepare. The calm before the storm had ended. Now we were planning the lightning strike. The elevator ascended 60 floors in a state of profound, humming silence. Beside me, William Davies stood perfectly still, his hand holding a slim leather briefcase that contained the entire truth. I looked at my own reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. I was wearing my best suit, the old navy wool, but I had bought a new tie, a simple, dignified silver. I looked like what I was, a retired high school principal. And today I was walking into the most important parent-teacher conference of my life. I was not nervous. The time for nerves was long past. All the grief, the anger, the guilt. It had been burned away over the last few weeks, forged into a single, cold, unshakable purpose. I was here to keep a promise. We stepped out into a reception area that was a symphony of minimalist wealth. White marble floors, glass walls, and a single stunning piece of modern art. A polite receptionist led us down a long, quiet hallway. Through the glass wall of a massive boardroom, I could see him. Mark. He was standing at the head of a long black table, a master of his universe. He was animated, confident, pointing to a large screen, displaying a series of brightly colored charts, that soared dramatically upwards. Seated around the table were three men in dark, expensive suits. They were the partners of Oakfield Capital. They listened with the kind of intense, predatory stillness that comes from a lifetime of deciding who wins and who loses. We paused outside the door. I could hear the muffled sound of Mark's voice, slick and confident. I took a slow breath and thought of Carol's face, of her hand in mine in that cold hospital room. "Don't let them make it cheap," she had said. I would not. Mr. Davies looked at me and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. He opened the door. We stepped inside. The room was breathtaking, with a panoramic view of Manhattan sprawling out in every direction. The city looked like a kingdom from this high up. Mark was in the middle of a sentence, his voice full of passion and projection. And with the solid multi-generational financial backing of our family trust, our Q4 expansion is not just a goal, it's a certainty. It was the perfect cue. As the door clicked softly shut behind us, all four men turned to look. The three investors registered our presence with cool, impassive curiosity. Mark's face, however, was a chaotic slideshow of emotions. First confusion, then irritation at being interrupted, and finally a flicker of pure animal fear in the back of his eyes. His confident posture faltered. "Dad," he stammered, his voice a full octave higher than it had been a moment ago. "Mr. Davies, what are you doing here? We're in the middle of a meeting." I ignored him completely. To acknowledge him would be to engage with him, and my business was not with him anymore. My business was with the truth. I looked directly at the man at the head of the table, the senior partner, a man with cold gray eyes and an aura of absolute authority. I walked slowly, deliberately towards the table, my footsteps silent on the thick plush carpet. Mr. Davies followed a half step behind me. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said. My voice was calm and even, the voice of a principal addressing the school board. It carried in the quiet room. "My name is David Harrison. I apologize for this unexpected interruption." I paused, letting them absorb my presence. "I am the sole and exclusive trustee of the Harrison Family Trust. I was told my family's name was just mentioned, and I felt it was my fiduciary duty to provide some clarity." Mark looked like he had been turned to stone, his mouth slightly agape. "Dad, this isn't the time or the place," he began, a desperate edge to his voice. Again, I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the senior partner. At that moment, Mr. Davies stepped forward. He opened his briefcase and, with the silent efficiency of a seasoned professional, placed a single slim folder in front of each of the three investors. The folders were a simple, elegant, dark gray with no logos or markings. They were objects of quiet, undeniable importance. "If you would, gentlemen," Davies said politely. "This will only take a moment of your time." There was a tense silence as the three men looked at each other, and then as one they opened the folders. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint whisper of paper. I knew what they were seeing. I had gone over the documents with Davies a dozen times. They were simple, direct, and devastating. The first page was a single notarized statement from the Harrison Family Trust. It declared in clear, unambiguous legal language that the trust had no current investment, no future commitment, and no financial relationship whatsoever with Sterling Financial LLC or any of its affiliates. It was a categorical and complete disavowal. The second page was a high-quality copy of the forged letter of intent that Mark had given them, the one promising a $5 million investment from my trust. Attached to it was a one-page summary from a leading handwriting analysis expert concluding with a 100% certainty that the signature of David Harrison was a forgery. The third and final page was the most brutal of all. It was a copy of a letter formally addressed to the Enforcement Division of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. It officially requested a federal investigation into Sterling Financial for the fraudulent use of misleading documents to solicit investment capital. It was not a threat of future action. It was a declaration of a war that had already begun. I watched their faces as they read. It was a fascinating study. The initial look of polite curiosity on their faces slowly dissolved, their eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Then I saw the subtle tightening of their jaws, the narrowing of their eyes. Their professional masks of impassivity did not crack, but the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. The air became thick with the cold, hard reality of being lied to. They were not just seeing a deal fall apart. They were seeing a crime being exposed, a crime in which they were the intended victims. Finally, the senior partner finished reading. He looked down at the 3 pieces of paper for a long moment, then slowly lifted his gaze. He did not look at me. He did not look at Mr. Davies. He looked at Mark, who was now a ghastly shade of white, his whole body trembling slightly. The partner's face was utterly devoid of emotion. It was this complete absence of anger that was so terrifying. It was the face of a judge who had already passed sentence. He closed the gray folder. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for Mark's glossy, colorful business proposal that lay in the center of the table. He did not open it. He simply placed his hand on it and pushed it across the vast, polished expanse of the table until it came to a stop directly in front of my son-in-law. "This meeting," the man said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a gavel strike, "is over. I had done it. I had kept my promise. I did not need to say another word." I gave a small, respectful nod to the investors. Mr. Davies did the same. We turned around and walked towards the door. I did not look back at Mark. I did not need to see the wreckage. I could feel it behind me, a vast, silent implosion of a life built on lies. As the heavy door clicked shut behind us, sealing him in his glass-walled tomb, I felt the weight of 10 years lift from my shoulders. The loser had just won, and he had done it without raising his voice. We walked down the long, silent hallway, our footsteps absorbed by the thick carpet. The polite receptionist at the far end of the corridor did not look up from her screen. To her, we were just 2 men in suits leaving a meeting. She had no idea she had just been a witness, however distant, to the complete and total demolition of a man's life. Mr. Davies did not speak. He was a professional, and he understood that this was a moment that required no commentary. He simply walked beside me, a silent partner, in the quietest coup Wall Street had ever seen. We reached the bank of elevators, and he pushed the button. The small light glowed, and we waited. The wall opposite us was a sheet of highly polished black marble, so dark and reflective it was like a mirror. And in it, I saw our reflections. Davies stood tall and sharp, the very picture of a New York lawyer. And next to him was me. For the past 10 years, whenever I had caught an unexpected glimpse of myself in a window or a mirror, I had seen a stranger. I saw a retired man, a widower stooped slightly by the weight of a grief that had never truly left him. I saw a man whose world had grown smaller, quieter, defined more by what he had lost than what he still was. I saw the man Mark had seen, a loser. But as I stood there waiting for the elevator, that is not who I saw. I saw a man standing straight, his shoulders back. I saw a quiet determination in his eyes, a firmness in the set of his jaw that I had not seen in a very long time. The old Navy suit no longer looked like a relic. It looked like the uniform of a man of substance, a man who did not need a flashy label to declare his worth. The reflection in the dark marble was not the ghost who haunted the lonely rooms of my house. It was the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with his wife and built a dream out of nothing but a recipe and a relentless capacity for hard work. It was the man who had promised her he would protect what they built. A soft chime announced the elevator's arrival. The polished steel doors slid open with a quiet hiss. I looked at the reflection one last time, and for the first time since she was gone, I smiled at the man I saw, because I finally recognized him. He was not a loser. He was Carol Harrison's husband. Mr. Davies gestured for me to enter, and I stepped inside, leaving the reflection and the wreckage of Mark Sterling's life behind me on the 60th floor. The doors closed, and in the quiet hum of the descent, I felt the simple, profound peace of a promise kept. The world moves on even after a personal earthquake. In the weeks that followed the meeting at Oakfield Capitol, a quiet routine settled back into my life. I tended to my garden, had coffee with old friends, and read the newspaper in the morning sun that streamed through my kitchen window. I did not seek out news of Mark or Jessica. I did not need to. I knew that the seeds of truth we had planted in that boardroom would grow in their own time and in their own way. The consequences, I knew, were inevitable. About a month later, I was scrolling through the business section of the New York Times on my tablet, just as I did every morning. And there it was, a small headline tucked away at the bottom of the page that felt both shocking and entirely expected. Sterling Financial collapses following failed funding round. CEO under federal investigation. I clicked on the link. The article was short, clinical, and brutal. It detailed the sudden and complete implosion of the once promising fintech startup. It quoted an anonymous source from within Oakfield Capitol who stated that serious and credible allegations of financial misrepresentation had been brought to their attention, leading to the immediate termination of the investment deal. The article went on to confirm that the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a formal investigation into Mark Sterling for potential securities fraud. It mentioned that he could be facing criminal charges. Near the end of the article, there was a link to a real estate blog. It detailed the recent distress sale of a luxury penthouse in Tribeca, the very one Mark and Jessica had been so proud of. The blog noted that the couple had reportedly moved into a small 2-bedroom rental apartment in a less fashionable part of Brooklyn. I read the words, and I felt no surge of victory. There was no triumphant satisfaction, no feeling of, "I told you so." There was only a profound and heavy sadness. I pictured Jessica, my daughter, in a small, anonymous apartment surrounded by boxes, her entire world of glitter and glass having shattered around her. She had made a terrible bargain, trading her integrity for a lifestyle, and now she had lost both. It was a tragedy of her own making, but it was a tragedy nonetheless. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is a hot, angry, and ultimately empty emotion. This was something else. This was simply balance, a course correction. It was the necessary, unavoidable consequence of a life built on lies. It was like watching a dangerously leaning tree finally fall in a storm. The crash is destructive and sad, but you know that the forest is safer and healthier now that it's gone. I had not sought their ruin. I had only sought to protect my wife's legacy. Their ruin was simply the price of their own choices. I closed the tablet, the story of their downfall reduced to a dark screen. I looked out the window at my garden, where the first of the season's tomatoes were beginning to ripen on the vine, red, honest, and real. It was a sad but necessary justice, and it was finally over. The call came on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the garden tying up the tomato plants that were heavy with fruit. My hands were stained with the smell of earth and green vines, a scent that always reminded me of the early days with Carol. It was a peaceful, honest smell. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I saw Jessica's name on the screen, I felt no anger, no anxiety, just a quiet readiness. I knew this call would come, and I knew what I had to say. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her breathing on the other end, shallow and ragged. Then a choked sob. Dad, her voice was a ghost of what it had been stripped of all its sharp, entitled edges. It was small, broken. I didn't speak. I just listened, giving her the space she needed. I'm in the new apartment. She stammered the words, tumbling out between sobs. It's so small. I can hear the neighbors through the walls. All the friends. They don't call anymore. The parties are over. It's all gone, Dad. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And I realized it was never real. None of it was. It was just a big, beautiful, empty house, and I was empty right along with it. I continued to listen, picturing her in a small, bare room, the illusion of her life shattered into a million pieces. There was a part of me, the father in me, that wanted to rush over there to comfort her, to pay her rent, and tell her it would all be okay. But that was the old me. That was the man who had enabled this disaster in the first place. Love, I now understood, was not always about making things easy. Sometimes love was about letting things be hard. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she finally whispered, the words sounding like they had been pulled from the deepest part of her. I let him. I let the money, the lifestyle. I let it blind me. I stood there, and I watched him disrespect you, and I did nothing. I chose things over my own father. There's no excuse. It was wrong. I was wrong. It was the first genuine apology I had heard from her in over a decade, and I believed it. When her tears had subsided into a quiet exhaustion, I finally spoke. My voice was gentle, but it was not the voice of absolution. It was the voice of a teacher, a guide. "I hear you, Jessica," I said softly. "I hear that you're in pain, and I'm sorry for that." I took a breath, looking at the sturdy green tomato plants, their roots deep in the honest soil. "The world you were living in," I continued, "that wasn't success. That was just noise. Your mother and I, we built a life and a fortune on two simple things, honesty and hard work. That is her legacy. That is the only thing of real value I have left to give you. Not the money, but the values that created it." I could hear her quiet breathing on the other end, waiting. "I love you, Jessica. You will always be my daughter. But I cannot fix this for you. You have to build something for yourself now. Something real." I paused, choosing my next words with the utmost care. "Your mother's legacy is about honesty and hard work. When you are ready to live by those values, when you start building a life based on them, you call me again, and we can talk then." I hadn't slammed the door in her face, but I had not opened it for her either. I had placed the key in her hand. It was up to her to find the courage to turn it. The path back to me, back to our family, was not through an apology. It was through a change in her soul. "Okay, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, I understand." We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call. I stood there for a long time in the warm afternoon sun, the scent of the garden all around me. A relationship built on dependency was broken. But perhaps, just perhaps, a new one built on the solid ground of mutual respect now had a chance to grow. 6 months later, I was not in a boardroom or a lawyer's office. I was standing on the worn wooden stage of a high school gymnasium in a part of the city that money and influence had long forgotten. The room was filled not with investors in expensive suits, but with bright, eager, and hopeful young faces. The air smelled of chalk dust and old varnish, a scent that felt more like home to me than any fancy restaurant ever could. I looked out at the students, and I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. "My wife Carol had a dream," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It didn't start with a business plan or a bank loan. It started in our garage with a box of tomatoes from our garden and her grandmother's old recipe book. People told us we were foolish, but we believed in the value of hard work and the goodness of creating something real." I told them our story, the true story of late nights and early mornings, of failures and small victories. And then I told them why I was there. Today, I said, my voice filled with a pride I hadn't felt in years, in honor of her spirit. The Harrison Family Trust is establishing the Carol Harrison Scholarship. It is a 4-year, fully funded grant for any graduating senior from this school who has a dream to build something of their own. A wave of excited whispers spread through the gymnasium. As I looked at their faces, lit up with possibility, I finally understood. I had protected Carol's legacy not by locking her fortune away in a vault, but by setting it free, by using it to plant new seeds of hope in the minds of the next generation. I had found my way back to myself. I was not a widower defined by loss or a rich man defined by a number. I was a teacher. I was a builder. I was Carol Harrison's husband, and my work was just beginning. This story teaches us that true strength isn't measured by wealth, but by quiet dignity and self-respect. When faced with disrespect, especially from family, the most powerful act isn't loud confrontation, but the calm refusal to be devalued. David didn't seek revenge. He simply removed his support from a foundation of lies, forcing those who took him for granted to face reality. It reminds us that our value is inherent, not granted by others. The most profound lessons are taught not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable power of the truth. Let us know in the comments below, have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and demanding respect?